As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I first discovered Suzette Mullen while reading her Jane Friedman post, Why Preparing a TED Talk Makes You a Better Memoirist, Even If You Never Intend to Get on Stage. I liked her voice and found her suggestions so useful I ordered her memoir, The Only Way Through Is Out. Then, in a happy coincidence, Suzette pitched me before I had a chance to invite her on my show. Suzette is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Wellesley College who co-hosts the Mainely Memoir Retreat for women memoir writers and supports LGBTQ writers through her group mentorship program, Write Yourself Out. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Today.com, and Brevity, among others. To learn more about Suzette and her memoir, please see the show notes. Before we get to today's conversation, I have a few questions for you. Have you ever connected with your inner voice? What was it like? Has it ever asked you to do something that was challenging yet ultimately for your highest good? Were you able to heed the call? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now let's get to my conversation with Suzette Mullen. Hey writers, have you struggled to develop characters beyond a laundry list of physical traits, or do you fall into the tired cliches of stomachs that roil and boil, hearts that pound, and characters that look off into the distance, unsure what to do? Has a critique partner ever told you your character's motivations or actions don't make sense? Or worse, has an agent told you they just don't connect with your main character? Let's face it, developing great characters is hard work. It takes both artistry and an understanding of psychology to bring them to life and make their actions understandable. It's even harder when that character you're trying to describe is you. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to teach the psychology of character development for memoirists on June 19th, 2024. During this 90-minute webinar, you'll discover the 3-step chain of events that determines what your character does in any situation, investigate the role that core wounds, attachment styles, and inner resources play in shaping your character's personality, and find out how having your character act as if can help you limit backstory and start in the right place. Plus, you're going to learn so much more. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. You heard that right, $25. For that price, you can attend the live webinar, watch the recording, or do both, and get access to the webinar's workbook and my slides. So if you want to understand yourself better, write characters readers will fall in love with, and feel confident that you know how to do more than just craft tired cliches, go to janefriedman.com and click on paid classes, or make it easy on yourself and click on the link in the show notes. Well, hello, Suzette. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am just delighted to have you on today.
Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I am too, and I have a copy of your book for anyone who's watching. The Only Way Through is, and then there are a bunch of different words, out. I love this about your cover. How much input did you have into it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I was asked ahead of time, just some general ideas on design, things I liked and colors I liked or didn't like. And then I was presented with a cover that was kind of like, here's your cover. And let's just say there's a line in my book that's the body doesn't lie. And the body didn't lie. I opened the attachment and my entire body started shaking, and not in a good way. It was a very, very different cover than the cover that I have right here. And it just felt very, very wrong. And so I had a great exchange with the team, the editorial team, and shared my concerns, and they kind of shared why that design had been chosen. We went back and forth a little bit, and then about a week later, they presented a completely different design to me, which is essentially what you see on the cover now, and I loved it, and that's the one that we went with. So it was a bit of a journey, and I I kind of panicked when I saw that first cover, and I'm so glad that I have the relationship that I have with my publisher. They're very
Nice.
collaborative and they listened, and it wasn't a confrontational, combative thing at
Hmm.
all. They wanted me to be happy, and I'm thrilled with the cover that the second cover they presented me with.
Well, and I love the story you just told me because I think it dovetails nicely with what we're going to talk about today. And that's what's inside your book, and also some very specific topics within it that I think are things people really wrestle with. So before we get into that conversation, what would you like us to know about your book?
Yeah, so this is the story of a midlife revelation that leads me to understand my sexual identity differently. And really, in the bigger picture, it's a story of learning to listen to my inner voice, trust my inner voice, and finding the courage to act on what I was
Hmm.
hearing inside myself.
Yeah, and I think that was such a powerful piece of the book. I mean, for me, these are some of the things that I really loved about your book. One, there's this really strong quest component. It reads like a story. And I like books that do a lot of different things, but that was one of the things that just kept me reading late into the night. Was like, what's going to happen next? How is this going to happen? So I love that about it. And I just think this topic is so powerful. You know, we often think that I'm going to call it coming of age, happens early in life and you just kind of figure it out. And by the time you get to be our age, because we're not that, I don't think, well,
Mhm.
how old are you at this point?
Oh, in the story, this happens in my early to mid 50s.
Okay. And so that's, I guess that's the part I'm connecting with because I'm
Hmm.
getting ready to turn 50.
Okay.
So that's, they call that the Chiron's return period where you're really confronting who you are and what's going to happen next in your journey. And so that's happening pretty close to where I am in my own life. And I think it's a powerful point for people to really reckon with who you are, what you're supposed to be doing, what your life's journey is. And the stakes in this story are so high. There's a ton of emotional stakes, and just, I think, practical stakes of like, what do you do? How do you do this? And then, so little certainty.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do agree. Part of the book opens with my then husband and I are recent empty nesters, and
Mm.
we're intentionally on a discernment journey about what we want our next chapter to look like. And as I've said on a number of interviews, spoiler alert, there were some surprises that we had not anticipated for
Yeah.
sure. But I do think midlife, there are definitely different times along the way of our life's journey where we do kind of take stock of where we've been and where we would like to go, and midlife is
Hmm.
certainly one of those, and I I was very much determined that I wanted to live my next chapter differently,
Yeah.
and let's just say I am in more ways than one.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about this journey is how much you've embraced it. So before we get any further into this, would you be willing to read a couple of excerpts from your book and feel free to set them up in whatever way you like?
Absolutely. Yes. So this first excerpt is from a chapter about a quarter of the way into the book, and it's called Sacred Vows is the chapter. I've had this midlife revelation, and at this point in the story, I don't exactly know what it means, but I'm trying to wrap my mind around what is actually really true for me. And so give a little more context. My husband's name is Evan. And there's a best friend who's a big character in the story. Her name is Renee. And I have, at this point in the story, I've come to terms that this friendship was more than a friendship, at least on
Mhm.
my end, that I really had been in love with this friend, and I still was. And I was in a marriage to a man, a long-term marriage, and that had a lot of good in it. I had a very, very nice life, and I'm starting to confront, well, what, if anything, do I do about this revelation? So, and There are a little content warning. There's a couple of four-letter words in this section as well. And one more thing before I do
Mm-hmm.
read, the the inner voice plays a big part in this story, and in the book, I personify the inner voice and I call it the voice. So you will hear the voice in this short selection. You might have to leave Evan, the voice whispered as I put on my running shoes the morning after Renee and I talked. No, I didn't want to leave Evan. I just wanted to end the lying and the secret keeping. The voice was a motherfucker that couldn't be trusted. It had led me to Renee, which had led me to unspeakable feelings, which had led me to this shit show. But this motherfucker had also led me to good things, like claiming my call as a writer, selling our big house, and focusing on social justice. The problem was that it was impossible to know when the voice was leading me to something good or leading me into deeper shit. And you might have to leave Evan BS. It was one thing to fantasize about running away with Renee, but it was another to take action. Besides, Renee had closed that door. And then I think we talked about me reading a second short excerpt. Would you like me to read that now
Yes, go
or
ahead and read
okay,
that now. And then we're going to
great.
begin to unpack what all of this is.
Perfect. Perfect. So a few pages later, I refer to a course and a retreat that I was on, and so this is a short paragraph about that. The instructor at the discernment course had said that the best a person could do was relative certitude, to say they had listened to the best of their ability, that they were as clear as they could be. The idea of relative certitude had surprised and disquieted me. Maybe relative certitude worked for small decisions, but shouldn't you know for sure before you took action on something big?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all want to have that certainty, and yet in life we generally don't. So I want to begin with the voice,
Yeah.
right? So, in your book, the voice calls you to write the unspeakable, which you end up sharing, which leads you on this journey. And so, my belief is that we all have that voice, right? We can call it all kinds of different things. And yet, so many of us have disconnected ourselves from that internal voice. And, when you were talking about your cover design, it seemed like the voice was there again, right? And so, where does the voice show up for you? And what does it look, sound, or feel like?
Yeah. So that was one of the joys, I guess, of writing this memoir. And of course, we're reflecting back on our past and all of the decisions and the important events along the way that led us to where we are, or the experience we're writing about in the memoir. And as I looked back on my life, I could see these different places along the way where this inner voice was speaking up for me.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times when I ignored the voice, and even though I knew at some level that it was speaking my truth, but the I just wasn't able to take action at the time. There's a short little vignette in here about when I was a young lawyer, and the first day of my first official day of work, as I was getting ready to go to work and riding the elevator up to my office, the voice very clearly was saying, not this,
Mm.
me. And I knew that this wasn't the path for me, but I was in my 20s and I had invested all this time and money into going to law school, becoming a lawyer, and I felt like I had set this course. And
Yeah.
it seems ridiculous now, I'm in my 60s now, to think that in my 20s I thought it was too late, but that's how I felt at the time. So for me, the voice shows up in it typically shows up in moments where I'm not necessarily expecting it,
Mhm.
and that's one of the indications to me that, pay attention to what you're hearing inside yourself because it doesn't typically send me messages that I think that I would, in my logical brain, necessarily, come up with. And for me, I experience it in a couple of different ways. One is I literally, it's not like I have, an audible voice in my head, but I do hear messages in words.
Mhm.
So, and there are many of those that are sprinkled throughout the book. And so I've learned to pay attention to those. And
Yes.
then it does show up in my body. And when people read the book, they will see that for a long time I was largely disconnected to what my
Mhm.
body was telling me. And I think that that was part of the journey is
Yeah.
learning to listen to my body and the body wisdom and, the physicality of what my body was telling me. And so I guess those are the 2 ways I experience it, both in terms of sort of a physical feeling in my body and then some actual words that I'm
Mhm.
hearing that are feel like they're important messages to listen to.
Yeah, and that largely mirrors what I've learned to cultivate myself. And sometimes it'll be like words that are a thought that's probably not a thought I would generate on my own.
Right.
And also, yeah, that sense of like ease in the body. And this is something I want to ask you about, and I'll share my own experience first, is that I think one of the things that can be really challenging when it comes to the voice is that we often have all of these voices in our heads. We have all of these different thoughts that we might have about what we should be doing or what would be best, or just thinking about your experience with your job, which I have this like big heart connection with you because I got this degree in mental health, and then in my case my body said like, no, you're not going to do that, but my brain was like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. This is what I trained for. If I don't do it, I've wasted all my time.
Yes.
And when people are trauma survivors, especially, and people who have fawning responses, which is something that is just being really explored, in the literature and part of the conversation, we can have these thoughts that seem like they could be the voice. And they're usually like, I should do this. I need to help this person, or to be good, I must do X, Y, and Z. And what I notice for myself, this is the difference between, the voices of pleasing or the voices of fawning versus like the voice, like the thing I need to be listening to, is that there's usually a should component to these other voices. There's usually a feeling of anxiety. There's often a tension that is actually a no that counters like that voice. Whereas when it's the voice, like the real voice, and it may be saying like, do something really hard, and I don't want to, right? Which is like the whole thing in your
Mhm.
book. And yet there's also this sense of calm inside me. Like there's relaxation, even if there's also an I don't wanna.
Yeah. Gosh. I mean, absolutely. Sometimes we've got competing voices inside of us, and
Yeah.
then obviously we have the voices that of people that are important to us and friends and family and all of the things. And sometimes the noise is just it's just so much.
Does that align with what your experience is like in terms of like how do you differentiate between all of the different voices, which are actually inputs from other people, expectations from society, versus like the voice you are really supposed to be listening to, which is your internal guidance?
Yes, absolutely. So there are a number of places where I'm directly grappling with that very thing in the book. And I completely agree when it's a should voice.
Yeah.
That tends to not be the voice that is the truth, although I didn't know that for a long
Mm-hmm.
time. And, at its the basic decision at the end of the day that I needed to make was, I guess I could express it in 2 ways. One was, am I going to I looked at it this way. I wanted to do the right thing. That was so important to
Mhm.
me.
Yeah.
My core my core value, if I had to just pick one, would be integrity. And I
Mhm.
wanted to be in integrity with myself and the things that I valued. And I was in a long-term relationship, marriage that was to a person I loved. I had made these vows, the for better, for worse. And I really, I wanted to do the right thing, not just for myself, but for everyone. So that was really a big battle that was going on inside of me. What is really the right thing to
Yeah.
do? And of course, you're taking in input from, other people and your all of your upbringing, and my upbringing was about playing it safe and not
Mhm.
taking risks, and for me, making mistakes was probably the worst thing I could have imagined. I mean, I'm absolutely a recovering perfectionist, and I still I don't know any of us who like making mistakes, but making mistakes was very, very, very hard for me, and
Mhm.
so the idea that I could choose to leave this safe, comfortable life I had, and that it could be the wrong decision was terrifying, and I think that's what
Yeah.
kept me in limbo for as long as I did, and so what I would say is there's a scene in the book where I'm really getting there's some time pressure that people will learn about, and I'm really getting to this point where I really do need to make a decision
Yeah.
one way or the other. It's not fair to my husband, it's not fair to me,
Mhm.
and recognize that I've had too much noise. There's been too
Yeah.
many voices, some of whom have been very supportive, but they're other people's voices. And I basically I decide to sort of shut out the other voices for a period of time. I fast from social media. There's a Facebook group that's very important to me, that a later in life support group that plays a big role in this story. And they were a huge sense of support. But I even decide I need to stop asking them for advice. I need to
Mhm.
stop listening to all of their stories, and I need to learn to listen to myself. And when I finally found that quiet and took the time to just sit, things did become clear. I could hear that true voice inside me. There's never 100% certitude, but there was a sense of rightness. There was a sense of,
Mhm.
yes, this is what I know what I need to do. I know the right thing to do. And then it was really a matter of, do I have the courage to act on what I know
Yeah.
to be true?
Yeah, and what I love about it, like one, I do love the time clock component to your
Mhm.
book. It ramps up the tension, like it's
Yeah.
doing all the things that good stories do, which of
Mhm.
course you're a book coach, so
Yeah.
you know these things. And I think the struggle for integrity is very clear in the book. And then the question becomes, well, what does integrity look like? Is it having integrity with myself and my own experience and, being integrated and whole? Or is it having integrity to my vows, and to the expectations of others? And I think, some of the things you do really well is like you create this breadcrumb trail throughout the book that shows that, yeah, like one of the conflicts I saw is like, I love my husband, right? I love this person and I don't want to hurt him. And
Yes.
yet there are ways that being in this relationship and trying to be true to my vows, right? And staying in this relationship in this certain kind of way actually harms him too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, that was part of my discernment process, which really was I read that short selection about discernment, and to me, discernment really is about seeing clearly. And often, I mean, it's easy when you have two choices in front of you, and one of them is clearly the wrong choice for many,
Yeah.
many reasons. And then the other one, is the right choice based on your values. And for me, I could see going in either direction,
Mm.
and how that either choice could have been in alignment with integrity. And just the way you described that was beautiful. I mean, in integrity about the vows I've made and the
Mhm.
commitment I've made to this person in this life, or in integrity about who I now understand myself to be, which is somebody who is different from the person, the 25-year-old who made those vows and who married. And, sorting all of that out, it was quite a challenge. And I hope I'm clear in the book, and if I'm not, here's a chance for me to be even more clear. I mean, this was my path, and this was my decision, and other people could come to other decisions
Mhm.
about what is in integrity for them. But just to recognize that it wasn't easy. Let's just put it that way. It wasn't easy, knowing that I wanted to be in integrity
Mhm.
for the totality of the circumstances.
Yeah, and so what I hear and I think is really important for people to recognize is that the way we get to relative certainty, right? That relative certitude is through the quiet.
Yes.
That's the only way. You can ask. It's great to ask other people for their input, and you do that. And I love the Lalas, which is your
Mhm.
Facebook group. I mean, that's like such a joyful piece of the story, and I just think it added so much. And yet, even they couldn't help you answer this question. You had to answer this question, knowing that no matter what choice you made, there are always consequences. And so you have to figure out each person, like, what are the consequences you are willing to own? What are you going to be okay with? Because what happens in your case, and I really am curious to see what advice you have in this area. And knowing that it's like you speaking from your I statements, you can't, like,
Sure.
tell everybody what to do, but you make a choice. You know inside it's the right choice. And yet making it leads to a dark night of the soul, right? It's not like it just gets easy. And I related to that so much because I've gone through that process in my own life. I think I've probably gone through it several times. We kind
Mhm.
of cycle through these things. And I think the expectation, I think the hope that a lot of people have is like, okay, I've done all this work. I've gone through the angst. I've arrived, right? I know the right decision. And now the good things are going to happen. And
Yeah.
without giving
Yeah.
away your story, could you talk about like that piece and like, what do you tell someone who's in the middle of the dark night of the soul?
Yes, absolutely. And I've thought about this a lot because, of course, my life has gone on after the events of this book are over. The book ends in June of 2017. So here we are almost 7 years later. And I mean, life goes on, right? And there are hard times and there are easy times. And one of the things that I now can see with having some perspective, which you don't have when you're literally going through it
Yeah.
at the time, is that when you've made a hard decision and then things feel even harder, that may just literally be part of the journey. And
Mm-hmm.
what I at times was misinterpreting, both in the events of the story that are in this book, and then even some events after the fact, which I'm planning to write about in another book. I took the hard times and that particular dark night of the
Mm-hmm.
soul as an indication that I had made a mistake,
Yeah.
that I had done the wrong thing, all of the fears that I had had, and that about going for this, making this really hard choice and choosing a different life. Well, what if it didn't work out? And when things were hard, I I went right to self-judgment,
Mm-hmm.
and you've made the biggest effing mistake in your life, and not recognizing that there's likely to be challenges, and there is pain and hurt. On the other side, I mean, I don't wanna say every single hard decision you make necessarily is going to end up with a lot of challenges, but I don't think it's
Mhm.
that uncommon, and I wasn't able to recognize it in the moment. I really thought I had made a mistake,
Yeah.
that this must mean that this wasn't because it I don't think I was so naive, Lisa, to think that, everything was gonna be perfect on the other side, but the dark night of the soul is named that for a reason.
Mhm.
It's a very, very hard time when you reach what feels like rock bottom, or you sure as heck hope it is rock bottom because you don't wanna go any any further than that, and, yeah, I was convinced that that meant I'd made a mistake.
And my heart was going out to the
Oof.
narrator when she was in the midst of it, because I was like, oh, I know how hard it is to, like, I'm not a part of your journey, right? But I know what it's like to be in the dark night of the soul. And it's so hard. And you describe it so well. So many things are happening, and I don't want to give it away because I want people to read your book, but it's very gripping. I
Thank
was
you.
like, is it going to happen? Like, come
Yeah.
on, come on, come on. Like, that was the feeling I had at that point because I was so invested in the story. And, I'm preparing to teach a course on crafting your memoir beat sheet, which that will already have happened by the time this comes out.
Sure.
But as I was thinking about this and what you just shared, the dark night of the soul is the rock bottom, but it can also be the time when we're processing what has taken place in the darkness before the dawn. And sometimes we need that time to process, which means feeling a lot of feelings, continuing to go through some obstacles. Like, it doesn't always just magically get better. It doesn't also have to magically always be bad either or worse, but taking that time to process that without thinking like I have failed. I think that's the practice, and that is hard. I mean, I'm not going to say I do it well, right? I'm not going to say anybody does it well, but I think that's the piece we're trying to get to is how can we go through those moments and see them as being for us rather than against us. And yet in storytelling, I must say, the fact that you show them all being against you works really well in Storyland.
Well, let me just, give a little shout out to Save the Cat, which I know you mentioned in your blog post, the whole idea of the beat sheets, and I did use Save the Cat, the Writes the Novel version, in the last big revision I did before I pitched the book, and it was so, so helpful, and because, I know I'm getting a little nerdy on the writing side now, but I feel like my opening was pretty clear and strong, although it did take me a while to get to where do you actually start the book. That's a whole nother webinar and workshop and all the things that was hard. But I had gotten, kind of basically where I knew where I wanted to open the book. And I always knew my ending. But that muddy middle, that messy middle,
Yes.
that muddied middle, I mean, when we're living it, yes, it's so muddy and muddled and but you have to curate that for your reader or
Mm-hmm.
they're going to, they don't want to read every single messy middle part. I mean, they need to experience it, but they need to experience it in a way that they're not gonna wanna put the book down, and
Right.
the beat sheets, that whole idea in Save the Cat where they're talking about, what happens after the midpoint, and
Mm-hmm.
are you basically kind of moving on an upward trajectory or a downward trajectory? And
Yes.
that was so helpful for me because I was like, "Okay, which is it?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a straight line in either direction. You have to have little bits that are up and down, but you have a general direction,
Yes.
and that unlocked a lot for me, and I realized that, for me, it really was pretty much gonna be a downward
Mm-hmm.
trajectory, and that helped me curate the actual scenes and events and the pacing that I did not have in earlier drafts at all.
I love that answer because none of us have it, right? And I think these tools can be so helpful. And sometimes people will resist a beat sheet because they think, oh, that's formulaic. And I don't think my book should fit into a formula. And No, we don't want books to be predictable. And like that's in that sense of formulaic, but learning how stories work and being able to map out your book in story form can be so helpful. And you recently had this Instagram post, and it's my memoir wasn't always a page turner. And you have this great little ebook that you created around this. And one of the things I love about the ebook is you share some outtakes from your story. And then you have, why I wrote this, why I cut this, and how I repurpose this. And I think I love that because writers get so attached to like, no, but I wrote this and I worked really hard on it. And I don't want to, if I take it out, I've wasted my time. And that's not true. And this is a great example of how you haven't wasted time.
I had so much fun working on that behind the scenes guide, and it did turn into kind of a meaty revision guide. And yes, we do get so attached, and that's been a big part of the journey because there was a lot that ended up on the cutting room floor for sure.
Oh my gosh, it always does. And what I can say about this piece, if you're a writer and you're getting ready to pitch your book, or you're thinking like, well, how do I come up with topics for my newsletter or a lead generator, right? So for people that don't know what a lead generator is, it's something that, is like a freebie that attracts people to your newsletter. This is a great example. I think you do some really great things in this. And my hope is that it has been very successful in helping you bolster your newsletter, which is needed when you're trying to launch a book, which you're doing. So, part of that cutting, you know, this is a book about coming out, embracing your sexuality, and coming out in this very intimate way through a really challenging discernment process. And yet, I would imagine there are some things that you wanted to keep private. How did you make the decision between what was stuff you had to write for yourself that you wanted to keep private and what really was for the public when you are literally coming out and sharing something so big?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as you mentioned earlier, I'm also a book coach, so this is a question I get over and over from the writers I work with. And what I typically say to them, and I think this was true for me in my process, is in the first draft, just write it all. And I mean, don't hold back in your first draft. You don't have to make those decisions at that point. The first draft is getting the story out, seeing where the story is going to lead you.
Mm-hmm.
But absolutely in revision, you need to start asking those questions and making those decisions. And I go through some of these things in that behind the scenes guide you mentioned, but I think how I would answer that question is eh, there were several scenes or parts of scenes that did make it through several rounds of revision
Mm-hmm.
that didn't make it into the final cut. They typically involve other people. They involved, largely my now ex-husband and my best friend, Rini,
Mm-hmm.
who were kind of the two other central characters in the story. And I really had to ask myself, is either this entire scene or this portion of the scene necessary to tell
Mm-hmm.
the story? Could the story be told effectively without it because it had potentially embarrassing information
Mm-hmm.
or something that might feel unnecessarily hurtful? I mean, you can't avoid writing things that might cause other people pain, period, because I don't think we'd have much out there with memoir if that was our test. But I did have to ask myself, is this particular moment or scene necessary to the story?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a scene or moment that or information that I think will could be potentially embarrassing and potentially painful. So that
Yeah.
was off the top of my head. I can't think of a whole lot that I held back that was about my story and my
Mm-hmm.
feelings. I mean, there's another example, again, without giving too much away, but there is a what might be described as a sex scene in the book. And I had to decide, well, how much of that do I want to put on the page? I mean, my
Mm-hmm.
book is not it's not a, romance, it's not erotica. So how much do I share that shares the emotional truth of the scene,
Yes.
and that allows is important to the story, but I don't need to share every detail.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are kind of some of the the questions I asked myself as I was making those decisions.
Yeah, and I think that sex scene needed to be there. Like that's kind of the payoff we've been waiting for the whole time. That's the whole question that, this narrator's been going through. And yet I love that you thought about, how much of that really needs to be on the page. And this idea that our characters are part of our story. So we can't not write about them, but certain details are actually their story. And so we want to be respectful, especially if it's something that might embarrass them or have consequences for them. So, for
Sure.
instance, sometimes people will, write about someone else's mental health, without their permission, without the other person's permission. And, that can have consequences for that person. I mean, there's lots of different things. And that wasn't necessarily a part of your book, but sometimes people, when they're making these decisions, they will share excerpts of their book with the person and say, hey, are you okay with this? Sometimes people make these decisions on their own. I could see, based on what I know about your book, and again, I'm not going to give anything away,
Mhm.
that there may be some people that you had to make this decision for based on your own and sense of integrity. And then there may have been others that you could have asked. Did you ever get input from other people around what they were okay with, or did you just do that all yourself?
Yeah, so absolutely a question that we need to ask ourselves. With my close family members, I kind of globally asked them,
Mm-hmm.
are there things that you don't want me to talk about, or are there things that you would like to see? And I had several conversations there. I'm trying to recall, I don't believe in those cases I ever showed them actual scenes, because for
Mm-hmm.
the most part they were like, it's fine,
Mm-hmm.
and there is, when speaking about, privacy concerns. So I have two sons who both, show up in this book in a number of places, and one of my sons has an ADHD diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
early in the book, and it's relevant to the story. When people read the book, they will see
Mm-hmm.
why. And I absolutely asked his permission,
Mm-hmm.
about that. And I mean, he's in his 30s now. But I asked his permission about a number of, specific items around that diagnosis, because it would have been challenging for me to write the story without that. But if he had said no, my relationship with him is way more important, and I would
Mm-hmm.
have had to find a way to tell the story without that. So that would be a really specific case. There's another character in the book who I did do a little vetting with in terms of scenes, but it was really more about using emails and text exchanges. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
something that memoir writers need to be aware of, is that intuitively, we think that if we've received an email from someone or a letter from someone, that we get to use it. It was addressed to us, and that's actually not true. It's the person who wrote the email or the text message or the letter, it's their copyright.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to use their writing verbatim, you need to have their permission. And so there was a character in the book where I had hoped to use some of the correspondence
Mm-hmm.
verbatim, and I was not given permission.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to find a way around that. And
Yeah.
and it actually wasn't all that difficult. So yeah, there was a certain amount. I guess I took kind of a middle ground approach. I know
Mm-hmm.
there's some people that will show like the entire manuscript to people, and then there are people that never show it at all. So I,
Right.
I took kind of a middle ground approach.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I think thinking about, again, what is integrity for you? And, what feels like a consequence you can live with, right? And because sometimes when you
Exactly.
share things with people, it does not always go well and it doesn't always forward your process. So thinking about that is really important. And I love what you said about who owns copyright.
Mhm.
Because we need to know these things because it does affect
Yes.
our manuscripts. So I'm going to end this with 3 lightning round questions. We've had such a great
Okay.
conversation. I could keep going forever. There's so much we could talk about. But what is the best piece of writing advice you've received?
Yes. So the best piece is really about patience, and it is about that learning to write in a narrative form is a skill that can be developed. And for those of us who are consider ourselves, smart and good students and all the things, this is hard. And
Yeah.
I was not patient at first, and I did learn that I needed to be patient,
Hmm.
and just having patience with yourself and trusting that if you just do the right thing, these are skills that you can learn.
Absolutely. And an analogy I often use with people is the analogy of cars, right? We ride in cars all the time, we get driven around, and that is like reading and speaking. And so sometimes we can make an assumption with, writing like, oh, I write sentences, I write emails, therefore I can tell a story. But telling a story is equivalent to being a master mechanic. It's this, and so, most people would not have shame if you said, okay, you've been driving a car for a long time now. Could you please change out the intake manifold? They're going to be like, no way. Right. And so, if we can think about the craft of writing and storytelling in that way, I think that's one of the things that can help people have gentleness over this process, around this process.
I love that, and I plan to steal it, but I will absolutely attribute it to you. I think that's just a perfect analogy, and I think there is a lot of shame around it. I mean, you
Yes.
especially when you're working with high achievers. I have
Mm-hmm.
several in my writing community right now that I run for LGBTQ plus writers, and they're I can tell they're judging themselves. They're like, "I should be able to do this more
Right.
quickly," and it just takes time. It really
Exactly.
does.
Well, I share this a
Mm.
lot, so
Yeah.
thank you for the attribution in
Yes,
advance. But
yes.
I think it is a really good analogy because it creates gentleness. So, what's one way that you nurture yourself, especially right now, because you are in the middle of a book launch? How are you nurturing yourself and your resilience?
Yes. So actually that's an interesting question because about a year ago, I decided to go back to therapy on a regular basis. I wasn't in a crisis. There was nothing terrible happening in my life, but I knew that I needed to build my resilience for what was
Mm-hmm.
ahead, for the literal work that was ahead, and just the emotional journey
Yes.
of, putting my story out into the world. So for me, part of my self-care has been a regular standing therapy appointment
Mm-hmm.
where I know that once a week, for the most part, I have a safe place where I can just share all the things. Yoga is also a big part of my life. And then the third part really is the community part, is
Yeah.
is just continuing to reach out to the people that are my people, whether they're
Mm-hmm.
my writing community, my LGBTQ plus community, other friends, just not isolating myself
Yes.
for sure.
And I think post pandemic, that is even more important because so many of us like got into our cocoons and like just lived on Zoom world, you know,
Yep.
and we can't do that anymore. We have to connect with others and take a village approach. So you have this excellent book that is out in the world. You are in the middle of the launch. If people want to connect with you or buy your book, learn more about you, what are the best places for them to find you?
Yeah, so the first place is my website. It's yourstoryfinder.com, and I have all the things there. There's a separate page about the book where you can buy it, all the things, and you can find out about getting that freebie, the behind the scenes, and you can also find out about my book coaching services. And then I'm most active on Instagram as far as social media goes, and my handle there is you are Story Finder, literally the letters U and R Story Finder, because somebody else took your Story Finder before I could get it. So I'm very active on Instagram, and I love to engage and connect with people there.
And if you miss those, they will be in the show notes so you can
Yay.
find them very easily. I want to thank you so much, Suzette, for being on the podcast today. It has been an absolute joy and pleasure to talk with you about your book and about the writing process. And I love it when people nerd out on story.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.